Hey there! It's the new year, 2025! And with the new year, I think it's time to reevaluate the certain types of videos I make throughout the year instead of a, 4-video upload schedule. Jesus. Bruh. I do plan on uploading a lot more modeling videos, but in those videos, I tend to skip over a lot of certain details that I noticed a lot of you in the comment section ask repeatedly. And one of my most recent modeling videos was how I built my Brass Thomas. A lot of you asked how to build your very own Brass Thomas. And that's of course what I'm here to explain to you all today. But first, a disclaimer.
The following tutorial is meant for people with some level of experience with Hot Tools, 18 years of age, and a comfortable level of common sense. Do not attempt this project if you are under the required age to handle Hot Tools, dangerous, or potentially hazardous chemicals, or do not have the required safety equipment to keep yourself or others safe. This video is for learning purposes and can be used to refer back to when you are ready to tackle such a task. Please model with caution.
I also cannot stress enough that if you are not prepared to do something like this, do not do it. Safety 100% would be your #1 priority, and even when I was making this Brass Thomas, I had multiple heat-proof gloves on to keep myself safe, and only when wearing those gloves I could maybe touch the scalding hot brass parts for maybe less than 4 seconds at a time. I also can't stress enough that if any of the liquid flux or any bit of this gets inside your system, please go to the emergency room as quickly as possible. Scalding hot brass and potentially dangerous chemicals are nothing I'd be playing with. Alright, enough with the disclaimers, let's just jump straight into this. There are a lot of tools that you would need to help you solder brass together. And I do want to also go on the record as saying that this is soldering brass, not welding brass. Those are two very completely different things, and for modeling Gauge 1 projects or any scale modeling, welding brass is not needed. Of course, for starters, you would need a butane torch to heat up the brass to the appropriate temperature. And of course, you can't have a torch without the fuel that comes with it. And for the namesake of the project, you're gonna need the solder to help bind the brass together. Now, there are two types of solder that most scale modelers use, which is rosin solder and silver solder. I suggest using silver solder for brass, as silver solder is a much stronger binding agent than rosin core solder. And of course, you can't use the solder without having some kind of flux to go with it. There are typically some types of paste you can use that are flux, but I personally prefer using liquid flux for this whole project, as it tends to flow into the cracks that I need to join together a lot easier. Before I get started, I usually place a piece of wood or some kind of board down to pretty much protect the desk or workspace I'm working on. I only mention this part because I do know that some of you do have a garage with a proper work desk or something somewhere else that you don't mind having scorch marks on. Now, what I typically do to the piece of wood, especially if it is wood, is I would take some water and, damp the wood a little bit to pretty much stop the wood from catching on fire if need be. I do recommend that if you are using wood as well as your working surface, that you do damp the wood a little bit, because, again, you kinda don't want to set your house on fire. Now, I just so happen to have a few scrap pieces of brass here that we can work with, for the demonstration purposes, of course. So soldering these won't be any taxing on any future projects I have coming up. We've already went over the tools and materials that'll help you bind these pieces together, but there are also tools that will help you keep these pieces in place. But before we have anything completely sitting in place ready for soldering, you do want to make sure that you sand down the brass bits that you plan on fusing together. I suggest using maybe 120 or 150 grit sandpaper to pretty much scratch up the surface. What this does is basically add microscopic little divots into the brass so that when you add the liquid flux, it will fill itself into the seams, and when you add the solder, once it heats up, the solder then fills in those seams and it adds a little bit of extra strength to the two parts that are now bonded together. As the solder cools, it then expands and hugs the sides of those microscopic divots and causes the two pieces of brass to stay together. Alright, now that the parts are sanded, it's time to set them up to get them fused together. Like I said in my Brass Thomas video, one of the best ways to hold these parts together was to use a set of helping hands, but now I've also purchased what are called 1, 2, 3 blocks. These are pretty similar in the fact that they hold the parts together, but they also supply security in the fact that the parts that they're holding together will help you have them at a perfect 90-degree angle. These are essentially just solid steel blocks that are milled in the dimensions of 1 inch by 2 inch by 3 inch. Once the brass pieces are exactly where you want them to be, you can go ahead and prepare yourself by cutting about a millimeter's worth of solder from the roll. After you have your piece cut, put it off to the side and add a little bit of flux to the area where the two parts meet. This is what I was talking about when it came to liquid flux. You can pretty much place a drop or two anywhere and the liquidity, is that even a word? It's a word, but it's not the word I'm looking for. The viscosity of the flux will then help it fill itself into the seam between the two parts. Now, this is when I use my tweezer to help me pick up the tiny millimeter worth of solder because my fingers are too big, so I just push it into the designated area. And now it's as simple as using the butane torch and heating up the brass to around 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. As you're heating up the brass, you can see it slowly turning this weird orange pinkishy hue. Now, don't be alarmed, that's just the brass releasing its copper to the surface due to the heat. Yes, there is copper in brass. Copper is not a natural metal, so the copper in this copper and zinc combo will then in turn rise to the surface due to the increase in temperature. The easy tell-all sign that your two brass parts have been successfully soldered together is that the little nugget of solder will, I like to refer to it as popping and melting into the seam. As soon as that happens, you can stop applying heat, give the brass about a minute or two to cool, and you've successfully soldered two parts together. I do also want to make it known that the solder will only ever flow wherever there's flux. And now that you've used a combo of helping hands and 1, 2, 3 blocks to successfully solder your brass parts together, and you've of course let the brass cool so that you're able to then touch the brass and pick it up off of your workbench, now it's time to get rid of that pesky copper that decided to sneak its way to the surface. In order to do that, you're gonna need an abrasive pad and pretty much give it a good scrub. You'll pretty much be wiping away until the regular color of the brass starts to show back up. And at this point, your brass part should pretty much look all good to go, but it's not clean just yet. What I do is take about 91% alcohol, put a little on a piece of paper towel, and pretty much wipe down the brass part that has just been freshly cleaned of its copper and get away all the dust and dirt and grime. Do this enough times and you'll pretty much end up with a brass model. I would say that making a brass model from the ground up is gonna require a lot of patience, practice, and a lot of prep work beforehand. So again, if this is something that you're brand new to, I don't recommend jumping into this head first. The pool ain't that deep, you guys. But I also don't want to deter you from doing something as incredible as this. Putting together a model completely made of metal is something that is very exciting and I highly recommend you do one day. But anyways, that's pretty much how you solder brass. If there are any other specific things you guys would like me to talk about the model making journey that I don't typically go over in my bigger videos, then let me know in the comments and I will probably make a video on explaining the intricate details of how it's done. I know a lot of you don't know how to really do an iMech, so that'll probably be the next video, but again, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and this is the beginning of a very long 2025.